Okay, so welcome everyone to this webinar on social responsibility programs for Canadian retailers. This webinar will be hosted by Nathan Zetterberg, who is the Social Responsibility Project Director at FishWise. And as Project Director, Nathan researches and develops initiatives to improve business practices that protect human and labor rights within the seafood sector. And of course, Nathan was instrumental in the development of the RISE platform, which you will be learning more about today. And also presenting with Nathan is Nala Achi. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Nala is the Social Responsibility Project Manager at FishWise. And Nala was instrumental in getting RISE over the line and is currently managing many of the website updates, case studies, and reporting. So with that, I will pass it over to Nathan and Nala.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dana. All right, everyone, I'm going to share my screen. Just give me once. Oh, Dana, it looks like you might need to enable that if that's possible.
Right. Okay, just one sec.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay, that should do it.
Okay, Dana, can you confirm that you see the slides?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Well, yeah, I want to start by saying thank you to SeaChoice and Dana and Leanne for the opportunity to present, and obviously to you all for joining the call. So today, my colleague Nala and I will be giving you an overview of the newly released and updated version of FishWise's roadmap for improving seafood ethics platform, or RISE as we call it. We gave a presentation to you guys, I think, just over 2 years ago when the original platform, or when we launched the original version of the platform. The project was supported by the Walmart Foundation, and it's a culmination of several years of hard work, direct industry engagement, market research, and NGO collaboration. And if I had to summarize, RISE is all about one overarching goal, and it's to equip companies to create the conditions in their supply chains for decent work for all seafood workers. And to do this, we set about building a web platform that would make social responsibility more accessible and relatable for the seafood business community. Folks like you, the companies and retailers who strive to offer consumers the most responsibly sourced products, but who may or may not have dedicated SR, social responsibility, sustainability teams. And RISE is about meeting companies where they're at and providing them with the guidance and tools that can improve their social responsibility programs to ensure that operations are in line with international norms, standards, and expectations. But a little bit of context before we dive into what RISE is. So the timing of RISE, in our point of view, it couldn't be more opportune. I'm sure you all know, but the landscape of social responsibility in seafood is changing quickly. We're seeing the legal floor rising with proposed legislation. In Canada, for instance, Bill S-216. In the US, we have Customs and Border Patrol withhold release orders being utilized more frequently, particularly in seafood. And then in the EU, emerging legislation for mandatory due diligence, showcasing how seafood businesses and retailers are increasingly being held to account for the welfare of workers in their global supply chains. We're seeing a steady, if not growing, emphasis in the media and advocacy groups on issues of human and labor rights, leading to changing consumer expectations. And we've also seen in the last, I would say, 5 years or so, significant efforts from many companies to make improvements, some of you on this call as well, which in turn raises the bar for all companies. Now, as a result of this evolving landscape, there's been a proliferation of resources, tools, and initiatives to address human and labor rights abuses in seafood. And that's a really good thing. Obviously, it's a sign of widespread acknowledgement that there's a problem. However, the proliferation of resources can also make social responsibility feel really like a really confusing space, really difficult to navigate or even understand. especially if it's only a small aspect of your specific job or you're relatively new to the topic. But if there's one truth that you can take away from today, it would be that there's not and will never be a silver bullet solution to social responsibility and human and labor rights. Having ethical and responsible supply chains is challenging. It requires intention, information, and strategic thinking and resources. But we created RISE to provide a clear roadmap to what a comprehensive social responsibility program, one that's in line with international norms and standards, must include so that companies can be proactive rather than reactive. RISE is a completely free online resource that outlines due diligence practices, plus gives guidance on other important aspects that make up a strong SR program. We've focused on the steps required to build a strong program because the risk mitigation approach that we often see companies take really just turns into a game of whack-a-mole. There's a problem here. Now let's focus on Thailand. Oh, now the media is covering Taiwan. We need to focus there. Oh, now it's over here. And I saw this firsthand when I worked in the apparel industry prior to FishWise, where the thinking for years was focused on compliance, what the media is focused on, and social auditing. And that approach hasn't worked for apparel or any other industry. And given the complexity of seafood, I don't think it's going to work here either. So instead, what RISE advocates for is for companies to take a proactive program building approach, one that's focused on operational models that integrates compliance and audits and the like into a suite of possible solutions. And this kind of systems approach will create supply chain resilience, sustainability, minimize risk, and less supply chain disruption. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Nala, and she's going to share a bit more about the platform and how you can get the most out of it. And we're going to conclude, with some practical next steps that you and your team can begin taking today. So Nala, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. So in this next part of the presentation, I'll be highlighting some of the tools and resources on RISE, and I'll be focusing specifically on the areas of the site that will be most interesting and useful for this group. So the first part of RISE I'd like to touch on is the roadmap, which is guidance for companies that consists of 8 steps. And these range from how to craft a social responsibility commitment that makes sense for your company, to assessing human rights risks in your supply chains, remediating issues when they're found, and communicating about your processes and successes publicly. And as you can see from this slide, the 8 RISE roadmap steps in many ways align with and connect with the 6 seafood progress steps, which means the guidance you'll find on the site can really support you in making improvements that fit within the seafood progress framework. Next slide, Nathan, please. Thank you. The next 2 things I'd like to touch on are tailored guidance for specific company types and alignment with international norms. So throughout the site, for each of the roadmap steps or foundations, for instance, you'll find tailored guidance for 4 company types. And these are retailers and brands, suppliers, processors, and producers. And this tailored guidance can really be useful as your company looks to build a social responsibility commitment, or to engage with suppliers or even processors and producers in order to make social responsibility improvements. And then alongside this tailored guidance, and Nathan touched on this in the introduction, you'll find that throughout the site, the RISE guidance is explicitly aligned with international standards and norms. And this ensures that we're not just basing our guidance off of FishWise's experience, but also the knowledge of experts from agenda setting organizations like the UN and the International Labor Organization. And this is especially important because legislation typically refers to or is based on these international norms and standards. So aligning with them can help companies be well situated to comply with human rights due diligence or other relevant legislation that may be in place or may come in the future. Next slide, please. So next, I'd like to talk about the RISE Foundations, which are 3 issues that we've prioritized and that together address significant sources of human and labor rights risks or vulnerability of workers in seafood supply chains. And the first of these foundations is responsible recruitment, because as we all know, the seafood industry relies on many workers from a range of places, and these workers often face risks from recruitment or migration or both. And these risks mean that a workplace may implement all the best practice policies and procedures, but if exploitation happens before workers arrive on site during recruitment or migration, companies will still face human rights risks. And in order to reduce those risks and reduce business risks, in order to strengthen company resilience and build a brand of social responsibility, companies really need to address recruitment related issues. And RISE in this foundation gives guidance on how to embed recruitment best practices across your supply chains, from what to include in your commitment to how you can assess risk and build capacity with your business partners and remediate issues when they come up. The second RISE Foundation is worker engagement. Company-led worker engagement is really powerful in supply chains where workers have little or no access to protections or judicial remedies, which is often the case in international seafood supply chains. So the RISE Foundation gives guidance for successful and effective worker engagement, which benefits companies by strengthening operations, enhancing knowledge of your supply chain issues, providing data to verify working conditions, reducing worker turnover and decreasing hiring costs, and then increasing confidence that standards throughout your supply chains and workers' rights are upheld. And then the third and final foundation is decent work at sea. Obviously, the Roadmap for Improving Seafood Ethics is a platform designed specifically for the seafood sector. And as we know, working at sea is unique in many ways, which is why it's important to address at-sea working conditions. Some fishers follow migratory species for long distances across multiple jurisdictions and face hazardous conditions on the open ocean and limited access to port resources. And this can create barriers to decent work and allow human rights abuses to happen. So RISE gives clarity for companies on how to combine vessel level solutions for decent work at sea with corporate due diligence practices. And you'll also be able to learn a little bit more about decent work at sea and responsible recruitment in our RISE e-learns, which Nathan will touch on later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So the foundations are a great grounding for understanding risk and responsibility in seafood supply chains, but we also recognize that the world of seafood social responsibility and the world of seafood generally is constantly evolving, and there are additional factors that companies need to consider. And that's why we've included a series of special topic pages on RISE. So you can see in the bottom left a screenshot of the COVID-19 page. And these pages address a wide-ranging set of issues from traceability and IU fishing to fishery improvement projects to gender. And the aim of these pages is to provide companies with a human rights and labor rights take on some of the current or important issues affecting the industry. Beyond these special topics pages, RISE also features case studies on leaders in social responsibility. And the goal, and you can see a screenshot in the top right corner of the case studies landing page. And the goal of these is to equip companies with the knowledge, resources, and examples they need to really take action on human and labor rights issues. And we'd actually like to open up this case study space to you. So if you feel like your company has a social responsibility project or initiative you'd like to feature on RISE, please reach out to us and let us know. As I touched on earlier, one of the RISE roadmap steps is collaboration, and we're really trying to encourage companies to learn from each other and to learn from the work that everyone is doing. And then RISE also features a community page, and you can see a snapshot of part of the community page in the bottom right. And on this page, you can find information to connect with experts who have on-the-ground experience or knowledge of topics ranging from traceability to worker voice mechanisms. And again, the goal of this community page is really to encourage and support collaboration. Next slide, please. On the note of collaboration, it's also important to make clear that RISE aims to be a complementary tool and not a competing one. It highlights the work and knowledge of many other experts contributing to this space. And one of the examples of the ways in which it does this is the resources page, which has hundreds of resources, some RISE resources, but many other resources, including tools such as the Verite Responsible Sourcing Tool and resources created by the UN and International Labor Organization. And by providing a comprehensive approach to social responsibility and highlighting existing tools and resources, RISE seeks to be your guide to envisioning and adapting the way you approach social responsibility in seafood. Next slide, please.
Go ahead, Nala. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. So before we wrap up the presentation, Nathan will also add some tangible next steps, but we wanted to give you some tangible use cases for how you can start on RISE today. And one of the new features of RISE 2.0 is a 10 to 15-minute self-assessment questionnaire where you can evaluate your company's current policies, practices, and procedures and identify what pages and resources on the site will be most helpful for you to start with. And the self-assessment can also be a really useful tool for informing internal conversations at your company in order to decide how to start or continue making social responsibility improvements. And with that, I'll pass it back to Nathan, who will talk about a few other next steps and conclude.
Awesome, thanks, Nala. Jump the gun there. Yeah, so another great feature, I think everyone, I'll just reiterate what Nala said. I think the self-assessment questionnaire is a great place to start. At the very least, it'll show you those places on the site that are most helpful, but more than that, it'll kind of help you understand what are the questions that we're asking to help identify that. And it, in a way, can give deep insight into your program and where you're at. And another feature that I think is really handy for this group in particular is our free online e-learning resources. So they're specifically designed for busy people like yourselves, and they take about 15 minutes or less to go through each module. They're mixed media, so they're fun. They're not just reading. There's some other things in videos and infographics and things like that. And if you take them, you're sure to see some familiar faces based on some companies you may be familiar with and some experts in the field. And these e-learnings, they're completely 100% free. And they're a great onboarding tool, both internally and with your business partners, to ensure you're all on the same page. In talking with companies, I've kind of referred to how important it is to have a common language with if you're a retailer, with your suppliers and vice versa. So you understand what each other mean when you're talking about social responsibility and what your expectations are. And we currently have modules for retailers, a module for suppliers, as well as one on responsible recruitment and one on decent work at sea. And we're looking to expand those in the coming months as well. So really highly recommend that. You do have to create an account. The account is completely free to do as well. It's just one of the systems that our kind of back-end LMS requires, but it's a very small barrier. Just ask your name and email, and that's about it. And like I said, they're about 15 minutes to complete the e-learning, and they're really, really useful. And embedded within these e-learnings and on the RISE resources page that Nala mentioned earlier is we have these templates and free job aids. So there's one template, for instance, for evaluating your company's policies against industry and international best practice, another for conducting social responsibility risk assessments in your supply chains. Now, these tools are just great ways to understand where your gaps are and where you can make impactful investments. Though they are intentionally high level, they can serve as a great precursor to conversations that you might want to have internally about your company's practices or with your supplier partners. And I want to be clear in saying that we know that this is really difficult work. We know it's really complex and nuanced. The solutions vary based on each company, your company operational model, who your partners are. And we all need to be very wary of easy answers to difficult problems. But I believe, and we believe, that regardless of where your company is currently in respect to social responsibility and the actions you've taken, RISE can serve your needs and help you identify what next steps you can take. You don't have to hire an entire team to start making headway today, because we've already put in years of work to ensure that RISE is comprehensive and that it's in line with international norms and standards to set your company up for success. And it's also completely free, so there's no strings attached. There's no greater investment other than the time it takes to read through the resources and apply them. And if you have a team who's already focused on these issues, then RISE can be your one-stop shop to continue to build up your program and equip your team for success. So here are the 4 next steps we just highlighted, but real quick, we encourage you to take the RISE self-assessment, see where your company should start. Really want to emphasize, I couldn't enough, that leverage the e-learnings either internally for training or with your supply chain partners. Learn about the RISE foundations, take time to really understand those 3 topic areas and how they impact your supply chains, the actions that companies need to be taking and the solutions available to them. And then really consider using RISE as a toolkit to help define your company's social responsibility priorities moving forward. See how you're currently aligning with RISE, and then use RISE to support progress and advancement. So the last thing I want to say is that we're available. We're available to have one-on-one meetings and calls with anyone that needs to walk through the site. If you have questions about the site, how it was put together, how you could apply it, or you just want to talk about your program, don't be shy. We're available completely and would love to have those conversations with you.
Okay, excellent. Well, it doesn't seem like there are any questions, so I think this is a great place to stop. Thank you so much, Nathan and Nala. That was very informative, even for myself. Yeah, so thank you again for hosting and for everyone who was able to join.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dana, and thank you everyone for joining. We really appreciate it.